here. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this webinar. And I have a few notes to say about the great Peggy Maki. I'm going to take a stab at her bio here. For over the last 3 years, Peggy Maki has written books, articles, chapters, and books about assessing student learning, as well as serving as a higher education consultant, specializing in assisting undergrad and graduate colleges and universities, higher ed boards, other higher ed organizations, and disciplinary organizations to integrate assessment of student learning into educational policies, practices, and processes. She has presented numerous workshops and keynotes at over 650 colleges and universities here and abroad. The most amazing source, she adds, of her experiential learning in the field of assessment. For 3 years, she was the sole consultant to the Rhode Island Board of Governors for Higher Education and its public higher education institutions under a multi-year assessment project. From May 2011 to May 2013, under a grant from the Davis Education Foundation awarded to the Massachusetts Department of Higher Ed, she served as the sole consultant to 28 public colleges and universities in Massachusetts to assist them to build authentic assessment capacity to report students' achievement to the department. Formerly, she was AAHE's assessment scholar and has served on advisory boards for AAC&U projects and projects for the Lumina Foundation. Currently, she serves on NILOA's advisory board, and she is the recipient of a National Teaching Award, the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching. On a personal note, I have a serious girl crush on Peggy Maki. My mentor and former boss turned me on to her books and writing, and I have several of her books on my shelf, and I have followed her over the years. And she is a welcome voice in this field, and I think you will enjoy her topic today. So I will turn it over to you, Peggy.
Hey, thanks. Thanks to you for joining me today on this topic. And I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, what prompted you to think that you would want to be a part of this meeting? Any reason in particular?
And you're welcome to unmute or put it in the chat. This is a little bit more informal webinar because we have a smaller group. So you're welcome to unmute or put your answer in the chat.
Okay.
And so we have an associate director for assessment, and then we have a a student learning outcomes assessment coordinator. There we go. Thank you, Janice. It took me a minute. It took me a minute. Anybody else? Jenny or Sam or Janice or anybody else? What prompted you, or Cindy, what prompted you to join this webinar or attend this session?
Well, my first language is Spanish, so I'm going to try to speak in English.
Okay.
Well, I speak English, but sometimes I start to thinking in Spanish.
Right.
The words. Well, for example, for me, I've been working with assessment in different institutions in Puerto Rico for 20 years right now. So most of the people, especially the faculty, saw the assessment like a punish process, not a process that we show to different entities what we do and we use the information to make a change in the program, in help the student and to be better in the courses and provide information to the accreditation process to show what we do and the different result that we obtain and the change that we do in the university or the program.
Okay. So you're involved in it. Yeah. Sam, did you want to add to anything?
Sam has written in the chat that she's continuing working through the idea of humanizing assessment in her practice.
Great.
I'm looking forward to hearing a framework.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks for joining me. And I actually was excited that that assessment leaders were largely involved in this particular participation we will be engaged in today, because you are the most likely people to be addressing what I'm going to deal with. And I have to say that explain how did I come to the position that we need to humanize our assessment reports, and what do I actually mean by that? I think it's that in my almost now going into 24 years working with campuses and actually looking at their reports, and they're asking me, you know, what do you think about it? That I began to see kind of a resistance to doing them, that they didn't feel that it really represented their lived experiences, the faculty that is, the lived experiences as teachers, and the sets of challenges and realities and dynamics that are part of their lives and their students' lives as learners. And so that was a major factor for me, is what did I see as maybe missing that could be better incorporated into assessment reports. But I also, other factors that figured into this is just how much higher education has changed because of technology, because of increasing diversity in our students, and the importance of addressing their growth over time without leaving any of them behind. And a lot of other variables that I'll talk about now that I just don't see included in the current prevailing assessment requirements that institutions or programs have to address. So my feeling was that there's a lot that is filtered out of the process of gathering, I'm going to say evidence, because this evidence will include not just data, but also relevant other pieces that can be included in the reports that actually will dramatically deepen the process of interrogating the results, and that lead to recommending strategies or processes or practices to improve student learning, but not just one strategy, but a number of strategies based on what we learned through this process that I'll talk about, because the diverse ways in which we learn means that we've got to be sensitive to how we actually engage students in the learning who come with different levels of readiness, different initial states of learning, lots of anxiety in some cases, fear of failure, among those other things. And so what I'm going to try to do is look at what these factors are that are so complicated and interwoven, but that really don't come out in the reports. And then some pathways to think about how to go forward, and how that, if this were of interest to campuses, because this is really early work for campuses to consider, as to how you would approach perhaps the pilot on a campus that would be interested in developing more lines of inquiry about the evidence that will shape the recommendations that come forward. So let me, and feel free to raise any kind of questions that you have. Let's see if I'm not, yeah. So what I wanted to do was to ask you first, from your experience, I'd like you to look at something that's fairly typical of what I see in assessment report findings, that you can read here, that only 33% of graduating seniors passed a math summative assessment based on their having to solve case studies drawing on their knowledge of general education mathematics. So that's, you know, fairly low percentage. And then look at the recommendation. Remember to look at that. And then I want you to think and respond to this particular question. So notice the finding, not very high, right? And let me ask you, what do you see as the challenges of identifying efficacious practices to improve student learning, in this case, their performance on case studies, based on the report that is basically deriving from a quantitative statement on exit level. So what's the efficacy of that approach, do you see? And I'll take you back to I want to give you a moment to look at this, and then I'll take you back to the actual page. So you see what I'm asking? All right. Okay, so here it is. So what is your response to that? What's the usefulness of this? Is it missing anything? What do you think about that? Any responses to that?
I wonder how students performed on, there's nothing about if they were prepared earlier on or how they did it.
You got it.
The intro developing levels, etc.
Yeah, really good point. So sometimes what's missing in these reports is this focus on the end without inquiry into what were the practices that supported their ability to do this, right? So I think that's what you're hitting on. And as it turns out, in this particular case, there was only one course that students took in their first year, and then nothing else that I know of. And then suddenly this case studies at the end. So you're absolutely on the money on that. Anything else anybody wants to point out? And it's going to lead us to talk about how do we look at evidence and data over time, because we shouldn't be surprised by the final results if we're looking along the way at how well students are doing. And as it turns out, this was actually the only one course that they had. And the question I have about that is, did they have much practice on drawing on their mathematics abilities to solve case studies? And I have an interesting response to that, having worked with this institution, to say, no, actually, all they did was memorize formulas or practice a particular mathematics skill, but they didn't have practice on case studies. So there's an issue for me of lack of alignment between the preparation and actually what you expect students to do. So that's one issue that I encountered and that I kind of want to address in this more human side of things. Anything else? What about the recommendation? Is it actionable?
Yeah, when I work with faculty, a lot of the times they're providing the increased opportunities, but none of it is really concrete. And sometimes it's really hard to go back to say, what exactly does that look like? When is that going to be done? And what does that look like in action, really?
Got it. Right. So that's going to be a piece of this evidence over time, is that one of the pieces we're going to want to look at is actually what were the practices or the approaches or the resources, whatever it is, that students had access to that promoted this learning over time to be able to perform the way you wanted them to. So it would have to be documented. It would be a piece of a filter that I'll talk about that would enable you to look at that in courses to see, were there other opportunities? Was it only this one opportunity? If there's no rehearsal in here, no further practice, there's a good chance that learning just won't be solidified in their minds of how to do it. So good point on that one, right, is can we learn more about our specific practices and faculties, what I call their lived experiences, teaching students to achieve the outcomes that we articulate. What about the strength, I would say, or the direction of the recommendation under this? because I struggle with this idea of providing increased opportunities, but what do we know about the opportunities that promote their ability to solve case studies? And if the truth be known, this is precisely the same finding and recommendation that the institution submitted several years before. And these are the same results. So apparently there wasn't much that happened as a result of this. And this is something people have reported to me, is that for all the work we've put into this, sometimes we just don't see the return in faculty using a particular strategy or drawing on sets of strategies to improve students' learning. So there must be some knowledge, it would seem to me, across the institution about what kind of increased opportunities would enable students to be able to solve case studies. But as it turns out, in this particular case, there was only that one course. So that's problematic. I would say I see that a lot. And I think this is really a case of our having to look at other kinds of evidence along the way to be able to see, are we really providing sufficient opportunities for all students to learn? And were the 33% of the seniors ones who already had a fairly strong knowledge of mathematics initially? So they're the ones who are the best survivors, and the others maybe didn't. I don't know, but that's another piece of information that I think we could look at as well. So if you follow my thinking right now, or any questions about that? Okay, so so that's just a matter of a backdrop here for this. Okay, so we did discuss this, and the challenges of this is that coming to terms with what the data said. I mean, the question I have is, who are the 33% who did succeed? What are the characteristics of those students? What are the characteristics of the ones that didn't? One, it's more exposure, but it also may have to do with the fact that people begin at different learning stages, and some need more practice than others, but that doesn't appear to have been addressed across the life of the curriculum as well. So what I want to really talk about today then is what I refer to as prevailing reductionist reporting requirements that actually don't get us deeply into what we know about our students, their level of preparation, the practices that we may be using that are efficacious to address students at all different levels of learning, and that filter out other kinds of evidence that I think we need to be looking at, that sort of brings out the human side, the lived experience of professionals in this process of educating students. And what I think makes this more challenging is that there are too many variables across the dimensions of teaching, learning, and assessment that we can come up with one solution or one recommendation, when in fact, as I discuss those variables, our world is much more complicated than I think the reporting allows us to talk about. I want to talk about the complementary evidence that humanizes assessment reporting, and the missing expertise and evidence from contributors across the ecosystem that supports student learning. That is, what we learn from each other, what we learn through professional development, what we may learn from this new breed. Many of you probably have this on your campus, of learning engineers, learning designers, instructional designers, who bring a lot to the process of interpreting data and recommending practices to improve student learning, because they have a whole varied approach to how they look at student learning. And it's not just data, but other patterns, such as their prior learning or their progress to a particular point. And then I want to look at if we have enough time, is some of the options for making reports, what I would say, more dynamic and interactive, because the world of teaching and learning is an active one. And what it's presented as is in a very linear way in these reports. There's teaching, there's learning, and then all of a sudden there are these results. But there's so much more that's underneath that we should be able to look at through certain filters or certain ways that we collect evidence that we would include along the way. So let me jump into that and move this. Okay, but there have been historically criticisms about the assessment process. I hear them almost on every campus myself, but there are two I wanted to look at that are about 10 years or so, 10, 11 years apart. And the criticism is exactly what I just said, is that the approach that faculty and other educators have to take is really one of compliance, right? You need to be able to do this, you need to do it this way, you need to report it this way. And what people have argued, and I think this is basically it, is that the reports really don't value or recognize the educators' lived experiences or the experiences of our students learning, which are all over the place. I mean, we have different teaching strategies, different ways we position students to learn, and they're somehow not discussed in a way that could engage us all in discussion about practices that actually work. And so what Ferrati said in 2012 is that, we're basically just ticking off boxes, filling in and squeezing in things that really aren't that convenient to squeeze in. We need to tell more about what's going on than we currently have been able to do. So that's in 2012, but then as recent as January of this year, there was a very lengthy article in the Chronicle of Higher Education written by Green, who refers to this process as a terrible tedium of learning outcomes. And she calls it box checking and Baroque language. And she cites this interaction with a faculty member because the model that they're using to report their results is based on some sort of logic model that objectifies the students. So there's nothing about the students we're educating, the issues or challenges they faced. And so that person says, I thought we prided ourselves in not treating our students as numbers, but you're asking us to do that now. So I think underneath this historic criticism is this sense that faculty really do not have a voice or do not feel that they are able to be more realistic about their lived professional experiences teaching students across a wide demographic, because everybody doesn't start the same place. Everybody doesn't progress at the same rate, but we are here to educate them. Any response to that? Have you ever heard anything like that?
I think, some people have heard it. Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay. So it is, it's certainly what I still hear on campuses, is it's just not meaningful enough. It's not reflective of the realities we particularly face. This, I think, is reflective of our realities. And this comes from a very new book in 2023 by Jesse Stommel, who is a leader of the ungrading movement, highly controversial. But one of the things that he says is he feels so pressed to give a midterm grade, because that's part of his institution's process, because that sort of makes people feel they're already labeled. And what he said is, I still have more to work out with them, and I want them to find their way, and I don't want the grades to be always hanging over them. And he said also is that all of what we do in teaching, and I think this is true of other people and other educators in the institution is idiosyncratic and happens differently for us at different institutions, at different times of the day, with different people. And I think that that really is what is at the basis of what I'm feeling right now and seeing, is that we've got to be able to recognize the complexities of what we're dealing with, rather than just a longitudinal look at the results without taking into consideration what did we do along the way to promote the learning that we want to see, and can we share that better in the processes of interrogating results, looking more at other forms of evidence, and that would lead us to come out with one or more practices that could improve a learning across our demographics. So what I typically see is people will generate, this is what we're going to do, and everybody has to do it. The problem with that is that there usually is not an implementation plan or a discussion of how one would do a particular practice in different contexts for teaching and learning. So one profession might say, I need to learn more within the professional world I'm teaching in, how to do that. Another one would say, well, I need to know more about that in terms of teaching online. And so we're not making these finer distinctions, but we're just sort of shooting out one thing people should do. And just to give you an example, a chemistry faculty talked to me the other day in relationship to this and said, in my first year chemistry course, which is not a liberal arts course, it is designed for first year students, I was told that based on our previous assessments to use discussion groups because they would engage all students. So I did that, he said, and I was able to use a particular program that actually maps out, gives you almost a spider map look at how well students engage in the discussion. And he said, to my fright, I learned that at least 10 people in that discussion group didn't even participate. And this is their first year. What is that saying to them, or what's happening to them that they didn't want to participate? And because he was keeping track of his practices in his course as he was teaching them, he connected with those 10 students and said, can I just have a conversation with you about your participation, or why you chose not to participate in the discussion group? And they said, because we didn't feel as smart as the other people who were sort of taking over the discussion. That's an important component to think about. So if we're proposing something, what more do we need to know about the effective ways in which we implement something that we believe is productive, but in this particular case actually made students feel pretty bad about themselves? But it was early on in the course, and they certainly could progress, but they felt, I can't do it. So this is part of what I'm dealing with when I talk about what's the evidence we really look at that helps us figure out what practices we actually should use. Any kind of response you might want to make to that? He said it made me feel bad. So the limitations of prevailing reporting requirements, I think, are that there is prioritization of reductionism and uniformity across all these variables in our lives. We don't have standard students, right? They're not uniform students. We don't have uniform pedagogical practices, not even in people who teach, 2 or 3 people who teach the same course. They have different practices. We don't have uniformity in that all students are face-to-face. There are variations now in how students are learning. And in fact, many of the projections are saying that we will become more highly individualized in our instruction as time goes by, because we recognize significant differences in how people learn. And we don't have uniform contexts for learning. So all of those variables are not uniform, but need to be taken into consideration when we are gathering evidence about our learners, the pedagogies, the modes of delivery, and context. And so when there's a recommendation that everybody should do X, or this is what we're going to focus on, where's the discussion about how you do it in that context? When you do it, what are the pitfalls of that? And considering all of those things in relationship to your learners. What do we know about our learners in that course? And I'll talk about those variables in a minute, because they're part of what I think is not typically looked at or addressed in the process of collecting evidence in assessment reports. So I may be losing my links here, Tisha, to move forward. Oh,
Okay. Oh, is that the next one there?
I don't think, let me just see. Yeah, okay. So yeah, what I want to look at then are, what are the human dimensions that are missing in typical prevailing assessment reports? And those are the longitudinal variables we deal with, and the various contexts for students' learning that they experience along the way. Some of those contexts may be very difficult for them to operate in, depending on their initial state of learning or their experience before that. And so I want to explore what these variables actually look like that you might consider in terms of reframing some of the requirements for assessment that actually gets us down into the more humanized aspects of our actual work. So now I can do the next one. Yeah. So one set of variables, and these are the most difficult, I think, to work with, have to do with the invisible world that students live in. And so it will be important, I think, to be able to talk about or reveal more about where our students are at any stage of their learning. And among those are the things I've listed here, such as, are they metacognitively aware? Meaning, do they know when they're having difficulty, can seek help, or have developed some strategies for how to learn what they're having difficulty with? But some of them may not. And that may mean that they're lost. And if we don't know this, then we run the possibility that they're going to sink through and we won't see them anymore. We know that the learning rates, if you look on the left, vary from one person to another one. And that has to do with just how much students already know or carry with them into another course. And that then shapes for us how much practice we actually build in to enable students to overcome challenges or barriers and move on. So I'm talking about this as being important evidence to look at in order to keep track of students' progress towards achieving equitable outcomes. So the most recent research from the National Research Council has really focused on learning rates and talk about where someone is at the time of that, let's say, first course or the next course they're going in. And depending on whether they are, sort of seasoned learners or seasoned in the learning of that subject, those students will likely need less practice than students for whom this is the first time they've learned something, heard about it, or experienced. And we'll talk about as much as 14 units of practice for those for whom this is very new information or very new experience. So no, and that's barely based, if you look across this grid to the prior learning initial state, is based on what we've learned before we've entered this course, or we haven't learned that can shape how well we do in that course or in the future after it. So it's really important to know something about what do we know about our students' initial state in our programs, for example. What did they learn before this that may be correct or incorrect? And how do we take that into account as we design the course for their learning and for these different paces or rates at which students learn? One researcher named Barbara Oates talks about slow learners and fast learners, and she doesn't mean the slow learners in a pejorative way. What she means is that we are not all at the same place when we're learning, and some of us have previous learning to bring to this situation. Others have very little or have been even unsuccessful before, so they're kind of nervous about how they're going to move forward. And when I show you some of the more interactive ways to look at evidence and filters, you'll be able to see that the more we learn about where students are, the more we can sort of project over time where they would benefit from further practice or rehearsal. Instead of saying, well, you should all have gotten it all in one particular course. And that's just not the way students work or human beings work. But there are issues also of their engagement, their motivation for learning, as I'm sure you've all experienced, their relationship with technology, their access to it. Do they know how to use it? Do they have access to it? And this whole issue on the upper right of their individuality. So institutions will say, well, what we do is we look at our results based on our demographics. But what I would say is you actually have to go deeper than that to say, what do we know about the individuals who we are educating? Because no two people are going to have precisely the same kinds of or approaches to the problems that they have or the challenges that we have. And what our role is to try to get at that, to help them overcome pitfalls, which I refer at the bottom of the right there to choose work on pitfalls and misunderstandings. And what he says is, we have to distinguish between, is it an error students are making, or is it completely a misunderstanding of a principle or a practice? Are there obstacles to them because of their previous learning of how they study? A lot of greater research on how students persist in studying a certain way that may not be the effective way to learn in that particular program or in that particular a course that you are teaching. They may not have the right study habits or the reading. Do they know how to read those texts that you're asking them to, or do they need help to figure out how you actually do those? Am I right in saying that those are some obstacles that students face actually? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, talking with faculty, I think these are some things that I like how you said invisible.
This is the invisible and hardest part, I think, of our work. But if we don't get to it and we don't bring it out more publicly, we're apt to not think about it and just say to students, well, do this, do that, without recognizing that some will need more direction than others as part of it. So this could relate to some of the kinds of evidence that may appear now in humanized assessment reports. The other feature of this, if this works for me or not, are the variables that across the ecosystem that supports student learning. So there's learning, yes, in the courses, but there's great variation in the context of those courses and in the, resources that are actually available to us and people who are available to us who can help us design for different ways of learning or the obstacles the students face. And these people, as I'll show you, will be incredibly useful in interrogating the evidence and the data that you have because of how they work and how they think, that will then inform the recommendation of practices within context, and ways to implement in different contexts as well. So this is another layer of complexity to our work. Yeah. So the way the ecosystem works is that these are all sorts of other considerations that we might wish to look at when we're recommending practices based on how some of these practices have been documented along the way, to say, this has really worked for me. And I'll show you a case in which a particular strategy is not only acknowledged as working for the faculty, but the students also said, this really works. And those are the kinds of pieces of evidence I think that we need. So, for example, we have options in the roles that we place students in, or the agency we give them, or putting them in a self-directed role. Are they collaborators? Are they co-creators in some cases of course content? All this range of things. Yet we don't report that out as part of the prevailing assessment requirements, because there are pieces of these decisions we make that can shape the conversation about recommended practices. So is it the case, for example, if students are in the position of co-creating some knowledge in the course or co-creators of a solution, that their engagement increases, their learning increases? I don't know, but I'm just saying that's what's got to bubble up from our work that I find pretty exciting. And one of the major criticisms that faculty have recently shared with me when I say, well, if you had the option of reframing or revising your requirements, what is it in them that you'd want to see? And they said, we really want to learn more about the practices that promote students' learning across our demographic. We want to come together more. And I think that means in the process of interrogating the results, the evidence, as well as in recommending practices, so that those practices are recommended for specific contexts. That's another thing we really don't typically talk about here. We also know, I have to apologize, I have a Newfoundland who sometimes puts her head up in here. What do we know about particular efficacious practices across a range of contexts in a program? And I think we got to value what faculty are saying. This works because I could see students do X, Y, and Z. It engaged them, etc. So what do we know about them as part of this reporting? That there's also practices that we learn about, and from this, what I call the new breed of professional developers now, the instructional designers, learning designers, and learning engineers, who bring almost a new perspective oftentimes to people when they are designing courses, but also designing them within the context of programs. So those people will be important in the interrogation process, and certainly in the process of recommending efficacious practices, because they tend to bring the longer view lens to things by saying, how does this particular outcome you're trying to advance student in addressed in this course, but then extended beyond that, so that students, no matter where they started initially, needs have been addressed so that they can make their way towards achieving equitable outcomes. I mean, as a faculty member said to me the other day, is we shouldn't be surprised by our end results if we've been paying attention to their longitudinal development over time. There's a wonderful amount of research on informal social networks at institutions between and among faculty, but also other professionals. And the research that's been conducted on that has actually taped, recorded the kinds of dialogue that occur between and among professionals. So, for example, faculty who may be using a particular practice would sort of automatically come together and help each other say, you know, I have a little bit of difficulty with this. How do you think I could improve that? Are working together to either refine a practice, improve it, as part of their just informal discussions. So the Australians have been tapping into these informal social networks to say, look, we want to learn from you people and understand how you have made these practices efficacious. And maybe they have to come to be discussed on the table as well as we discuss students' performance on certain outcomes. We need to think maybe about what are the forms of support and resources that students had access to that assisted them. And included in that would be some really fascinating research on peer-led review that prepares peers to give feedback to their fellow colleagues, but also the peers to accept that, learn how to accept that. And the argument is we all need to do that because we're all going to be in those positions in our lives. And a book that I will cite at the end of this does a great job of showing how in different contexts you actually could use peer-to-peer evaluation or assessment of students' work very well, and how you prepare students to do that. And then there are some who are engaged in context, evidence-based or research-informed practices, including many who are innovating practices. This is a rich area to say, if you innovate a practice or you innovate a new course, what are the particular strategies or practices that you're using that engages students and helps all of them move forward? And I think a question that I raised in the description for this webinar was, what courses, for example, have typically filtered out women and underrepresented students in the past? In other words, they've dropped out, they've failed, they have not been successful, and their hopes are dashed. And if there is an innovation to that, what's the content, what's the approach that enables those populations to become successful would be something I'd want to be talking about. All right, let's go to the next one because there had to be another tree. Did I get both the trees in? Maybe not. Let me just make sure here. Okay. Yeah. All right. So that's sort of the kind of things that I think we need to think about. And if I were to open this up to a pilot group on campus, I think what I would say is, and I'll talk about a more structured way to talk about this, is what's missing for you that would engage you, that is the faculty and other professionals, in engaging in assessment reporting. What matters to you that would help you? What I think is also missing, because these people can add a level of humanity to everything because of their own areas of specialty, are the people who are not at the assessment table, especially during the process of interrogating evidence and recommending practices. So I list this range of people and just offer them as possibilities for people you could draw in to deepen the conversations so that it's not just here's an answer and we're finished with the report. So again, drawing on social networks, drawing on your students, their feedback, incredibly important. All the subject matter experts, really wonderful. There's an interesting piece about the learning designers that I wanted to share with you. Next, if I can move this. Yeah, no, I got to go back. This is going too fast for me here. Yeah, of how they are approaching working with faculty, particularly faculty now. And they like to work with the subject matter experts with student learning data. So that's some of what I've been talking about today. What more do we know about our students to humanize this? And looking at research, understanding the material and creating quality materials. They take a multidimensional approach to looking at your results. And what they will also usually say is, what do you know about students when they came in, their prior learning, their experiences? What do you know about the stumbling blocks they face, the pitfalls, the challenges? And how have you planned or developed the curriculum to address those challenges so that students can be successful? Is how they're working. These are going to be major players in the design of curricula and co-curricular in the future. There are going to be these kinds of people helping you think through more of how we design for learning, which I think is really kind of fascinating. So the stakeholders who are involved in this are broad, from a president or provost who doesn't necessarily have to be at every meeting, but should know what direction people are going, including what their needs are. Certainly, committees for teaching and learning are involved, centers for teaching and learning, and the deans, and then all kinds of networks that might exist across the campus that could be tapped for learning more about efficacious practices that just simply have not come up in the most of the reports that I have ever seen. So it kind of limits discussion and limits how we can help people move forward from there on. Let me just stop for a question to see if any of you have a question, comment.
We don't see any in the chat. If you do have a question or comment, feel free to put it in the chat.
So I'll give you a moment because I know I always run out of time. Let me just jump back for a minute to see, are there any untapped contributors that you would consider bringing into the processes of interrogating assessment results or recommending? Any that you haven't typically used, but that you might consider? Or I'll just leave that as something to think about afterwards, because all of those contributors can really humanize how you look at your results to say, let's think about these students having these sets of issues and how are we going to move forward.
How cool would it be if we brought in students to look at the results?
You got it. And you'll notice that I wrote them down there in the list there, that I think they are the missing voices in these interrogation and recommendations. They are very effective at times when I've seen them in being able to say, this strategy really helped us or me because I always misunderstood X, for example. So yeah, you'll see as you come back to this that they are among major ones. And students who served as tutors and mentors, they see the struggles that students have. Those voices should be a part of the discussion as well. So it leads me to say at the end here, because I know we're running out of time, is how can we, in the reporting process, sort of humanize the results in terms of how we present the results? And my main takeaway here is that it's important for us to enable people to visualize the data over time, and then accompany that with any sources of relevant complementary evidence that I've talked about. You may not do all of it, but there are some parts of it that would say that's really important for us to build into the conversations that we have. And so specifically, let me just point to Canvas has, and I have permission to use this, has multiple ways to visualize how students are performing. This is not an active chart, but there is an active chart I'll show you right now. And in this case, we're looking at how an individual student in a course in purple in her History 101 in green is doing in comparison with students in all other sections. So you see those ups and your downs, and those are important for, that sort of transformative often when people see, wow, why that drop? Now, this is just for a particular assignment, but imagine if you're seeing this over time for your students. And when we now have the capability through analytics and new platforms to actually track a student over time so that we can intervene and address that student. So in this particular case in which Emily sort of drops, and you see her drop under both in her participation and her views of reading material, is that she experienced a traumatic experience in her life. Something to consider. And many of you know this from the pandemic, that you get to know your students perhaps more than you had ever learned before. This is a dynamic platform from Enflux that actually continues to show year by year how each student is doing against threshold performances. So the blues are where students have done really great or even high performance. And then the red and the yellow are, dropping and then very, very low. So, and you can click because you can see up there the student across time. You could click onto the student, that's not revealed here because of privacy, to see what specifically that student is struggling with that we need to know about now, rather than letting it persist. And you can do group comparisons, but there's a filtering system built into this that is incredibly helpful for those of us in higher education to say, we need to see this to be able to support all of our students. Yes, Sam. Oh, this is magic. Yeah. Yeah. It's a wonderful platform. I've heard faculty rave about it. And in fact, a faculty member who uses, or from a program uses this, said, we thought that a student who was at the lowest level early on in her career under, I think it was biological systems, she didn't do well there, that was a sign she just was not going to make it in our program. But because we knew that, we knew what she needed further practice in, and we did that. And he said by the next semester, she was on board. And she was so excited because she said, even I knew I wasn't that strong, but I got it now. Those are kind of exciting moments. Recently, a number of other faculty shared with me other programs that they use. And so I really want to end by well, I'll go to a couple things before I leave, but in the end, I have a list of possible ways to make the presentations engaging, dynamic, interactive. You can look at learning over time, students over time. And it more effectively represents the lived experience of students and faculty is what I'm going to say, which is for me the major piece that I think is missing. So let me just do a couple other things here because I know we're running over. Do you have patience for the few more here? Another thing to consider is whether or not you can develop what I call informational placemats in your evidence you're bringing forward that sort of summarize an effective practice or a challenge that students faced and how you overcame it. So you're really sharing as part of this process of reporting out. And so these placemats might be doing any one of these things, but I want to show you what one looks like so you can leave saying, here's it. And this is an exciting one that came that faculty, as it says, teachers love it and students love it too, is that it's a system of providing students feedback that was very successful in a program. So in their now reporting, they sort of became the trailblazers at the institution of saying, I want to put this placemat in because if it worked for us, it could work for you. And the interesting thing that the student says at the bottom right is, I really appreciate how you kept in contact and keep an eye on us. It's such a big class. Right. That's the one thing that we always wonder about in large classes is how we may lose students here. So that's what I would call a placemat that could be inserted in something about the strategies that you've learned work to help students overcome them, or all just these informational pieces that I'm gathering students, faculty are saying, gee, I wished we had more opportunity to discuss this. You could consider placemats with narratives, maybe about the, at least the profile of students and the issues they face. But key is always rolling evidence, data and evidence over time against your key performance times, and interactive data. So on the very final sheet, I'll come back to, because I just want to show this to you, because you'll have access, right? They will have access to this. Oops. Yep. I listed some of the possibilities. They may not all work, but they're all sort of make this real. They bring it all to life. And the other day, a person said to me, we actually already use an interactive scatter plot, she said she used, and another one that I wasn't quite familiar with, but she said it has all these kinds of filters you're talking about, Peggy, that enable us to see realistic what has really taken place with our students. So that's a resource you may want to use. And I just want to jump to one other thing. If you were to sort of bring this issue forward on a campus, I would say go gently into the night and maybe say to your leadership at the institution, would you be opposed to my bringing together a body? This is what people are telling me they're doing. A group of people to talk about what else they need to see or experience that would be really engaging to them, informative, and bring them together. Maybe to even engage them further in the interrogation process or in the process of identifying and explaining how to use certain practices. But this model is a really fine way if you have a group and you want to try this out, of engaging people in exchanging in various ways of communicating what their responses might be, for example. So instead of saying, okay, everybody, how would you want to change what we're doing? And people just throw everything against the wall. There are steps and outcomes for micro steps and outcomes for each of the levels here. But what I value most about this particular approach is that it does remove existing barriers for discussions, or to say, let's not worry about that. Let's focus on the creative or the freedom for you to express what you think we should be collecting more of, and let it come up from them. I think what I feel when I talk to faculty in particular is that this is an instance of somebody else telling them what to do, and their voices have not helped to build what will be most essential for them to learn from and engage from. And so I think to deepen this and make it more meaningful, if we can, build on what you have or reframe what you have, you can maybe build more interaction in all of this. That's it. Too fast. Anything you want to say?
Any comments for Peggy or any questions? I know we're a little bit over and we appreciate your time.
Sure.
If you have any questions, please put it in the chat. I'll finish up a little bit. This is the second time I've seen a version of this presentation. I saw it a couple weeks ago when we practiced, and I've learned 2 more things. So the first time I saw it, I bought 2 books from Amazon. The second time I've seen it, which is today, I learned about really thinking about involving student voices in the assessment data, and how the assessment process, we think of it as just an annual process, but it's really longitudinal. And if we had longitudinal data, we could actually have deeper conversations and deeper actions to improve student learning. So thank you, Peggy, for that. Those tidbits, more tidbits too, but and we will send the recording and with Peggy's permission, a copy of the PowerPoint, at least definitely that last slide, the resource slide, to you. thank you very much for hanging in there with us, and we hope to see you at another event. I see both Janice and Sam have found this very helpful and have gotten some more information to think about. So thank you very
Oh,
much,
great. Well,
Peggy.
thanks for participating. And feel free at any point to email me if I can clarify anything, or you may move more in this direction and just want to talk about possibilities. I'm certainly always open to it. So thanks for joining. I was happy to be with the leaders of this on campuses. You will be the important ones in this.
All right. Well, thank you, Peggy, and everybody have a great day.
Okay.